It's no secret that 2023 was one of, if not the greatest year for gaming, perhaps ever. With a plethora of huge releases like Tears of the Kingdom, the standard setting Street Fighter VI, indie gems like Sea of Stars and Lethal Company, and the industry-dominating Baldur's Gate 3, and that's just to name a handful. With huge names like these coming out at a pace most could hardly keep up with, gamers were feasting for the majority of the year. Meanwhile, I was hardly taking part. I didn't play much of what released in 2023. Early in the year, I decided to make a spreadsheet of my backlog with the intention of clearing away as much of it as possible. Naturally, I also added to that list. But it wasn't the new games coming out that I was adding. The majority of it was older games, a lot of short indie titles, games you find in the less than $5 category. Not all though, of course. I did play some of those big brand titles, and after looking back at the year and what I played during it, I wanted to take a bit to kind of document what I played through it. The order listed is, for the most part, the order I completed them in, so it's not a ranking or anything like that, but I will mention a few that were personal standouts. Also, some of the games were really short or have already been covered to death, so I won't say too much on those. And lastly, this video is pretty much entirely subjective. These are mostly just quick points referencing notes that I took on each game after I completed them. So to kick things off with one of those under $5 indie games, Tori 3D is a super minimal, low-poly 3D platformer collectathon that you can beat in less than an hour if you're playing casually. It is exactly what it says it is, and it makes for a good time if you're looking for something quick and simple in that genre. It was a surprisingly satisfying old-school platformer. It had some kinks. There were some jumps that seemed off, like collision detection wasn't quite mapped properly, but overall it was a good time. Next up was Super Mario Maker 2 for the Switch. Before playing this, I had almost no experience with Mario games, at least aside from Mario Kart, and I decided on Mario Maker because it seemed like it offered the most variety and would be very easy to get into as someone who was basically new to the franchise, at least in terms of direct personal experience or engagement. Luckily, I think I made a good decision by starting here. Mario Maker 2 offered a wide range of difficulty, design variety, and flavor with asset usage spanning basically the entire franchise. Overall, it was a really good experience that was family-friendly fun in one moment, and then surprisingly challenging in another. I recognize the strengths of the design elements that Mario is comprised of, and it's no surprise that it dominates the 2D platformer space. But after completing it, I felt that Mario, at least in that genre, just wasn't quite for me. It wasn't something I saw myself going back to play user-made levels, make levels myself, or replay any of the other regular levels. It was good, but I just kind of felt done with it once it was finished. Next, I played Paratopic, which was a short but gripping experience. I was confused to the point where I was thinking the game was inducing temporary schizophrenia. It had me deep in thought, fully engaged, and far beyond the edge of my seat. It was like watching a really good psychological thriller movie, but you have to make all the choices. I honestly couldn't recommend it enough. It was fantastic, and it only took about an hour to complete. So if you're considering, time can't be an excuse. And despite the inexpensive base price, it also goes on sale pretty often, so I guess you don't really have any excuse. Keeping with the confusing horror, I moved on to Fatum Batula, another PlayStation 1 styled psychological horror, this one leaning to the surreal end of the spectrum. Unlike Paratopic though, I had a very dull time. I probably missed something, or maybe a lot of things, but it felt like I was walking around clicking things with no idea as to why. Kind of just hoping something would happen and that I would figure it out eventually. Unfortunately, that moment never came. I wandered aimlessly feeling I was wasting my time until I gave up and just looked up what to do. Turns out there are 8 different endings to the game, none of which I have any hope that I could have earned on my own. I guess these kinds of games just aren't for me. But I will say, visually, aesthetically, it was very attractive. Lots of unsettling but somehow beautiful imagery with a unique setting and characters. Even though I didn't enjoy it, it was still very memorable. If it wasn't already obvious that I'm a fan of low poly graphics, it definitely will be by the end of this video, as next on the list is MacBat 64, another 3D platformer collectathon inspired by the classics of yesteryear. This is very similar to Tori 3D in terms of scale and focus. If you're looking for a straight-to-the-point platformer that you can beat in one sitting, you'll absolutely love it. I got 100% completion, and I think my total playtime was only around an hour. It's packed full of charm and nostalgia, and will make for an easy but satisfying full playthrough sitting. I was introduced to Kirby in 2022 with The Forgotten Land, which I absolutely loved. It had me so curious about the franchise that I made it a point to pick up as many games as I could from it. Before 2023, I only played Forgotten Land, Dreamland, and Dream Buffet, so I started the year off with Star Allies. It was incredibly easy, and I wish there was some difficulty settings for at least some amount of challenge as a choice, but it made for a very casual, turn your brain off and space out kind of game. The performance was perfect, and actual gameplay was buttery smooth, with plenty of mechanics to experiment with and all of that Planet Popstar charm. The only issues I had was with companion AI. Sometimes they just didn't seem to know what to do, or would get stuck and I'd have to wait for them to figure it out. Other than that little speed bump, it was a great time. An easy recommendation from me if you want something cute, super easy, and short enough to beat in just a few sittings. To change the mood completely and dive into something with absolutely no cuteness at all, I played What Remains of Edith Finch. If you're an emotional person, easily sad, or just easily influenced emotionally, I don't think I could recommend it. Unless you like feeding into that and enjoy excessively sad stories, I guess just be warned. I played it on the Switch, and that version definitely left things to be desired. It had a lot of frame drops and seemed to be chugging along and barely scraping by for most of it, unfortunately. I'm assuming it runs better on other systems, unless it's just poorly optimized. Let me know in the comments if you played it on another system and had a better experience. Despite the excessive sadness and poor performance, it did offer a unique experience, with numerous and surprisingly varied stories, both in subject matter and delivery, with enough gameplay changes to keep you engaged throughout. Being someone who favors dark subject matter in media, I followed up Edith Finch with A Short Hike, and I'm having a strange time writing this script and realizing I actually play a lot of cute games, and I wasn't really aware of this until now, so I feel kind of weird. But anyways, A Short Hike was adorable. Wholesomeness off the charts. It's a potentially short game depending on how goal-oriented you are, and potentially a very long game if you really take your time and enjoy wandering around and kind of just getting lost in the world. This game is equal to meditation to me. There's nothing really challenging about it or frustrating. You're kind of just existing in a space, walking around, talking, helping those around you, trying to climb a mountain. Despite the simplistic graphics, it is gorgeous, and I would absolutely recommend it to anyone. It's a game I could easily see myself coming back to, and I probably will soon. Things have been pretty positive so far, so I think it's about time for a miss. Gone Home is a walking simulator, interactive story in which delivery didn't really make sense considering the player character. The story was extremely simple and honestly not really original at all. It felt like a handful of characters that I've already heard of before going on strings of expository dumps with nothing particularly unique to offer. Whatever realizations were made throughout, if you could even call them that, were simple and unexciting. It all just felt very bland. It kind of felt like I missed something, which resulted in me missing half of the story, because it just felt so empty and uninspired. It was really disappointing. If you played Gone Home and enjoyed it, let me know in the comments what I missed, because I simply just didn't understand it. Back to positives, I went on to play The Stanley Parable. I know more than enough has been said about this game, so I'll keep it brief and just say, it's a meta mind melter. You will question your decision making both in-game and out, and if you dive too deep, it just might have you contemplating your life choices for a while. Definitely one of those games that you need to just play yourself to really get that experience. Can't really be described to give much insight, unfortunately. Naturally, I returned to the world of low poly graphics. Proteus is hard to describe. It's like a very meditative exploration discovery simulator. I don't really know how else I can describe it in terms of genre. By definition, I guess it's just a walking simulator since there's no real action you can take to interact with the world directly. All you can do is move around and see how the world changes and responds to you. It's extremely short, but very relaxing, peaceful, and another game that's just about as good as meditation. To 180 from that, I played Metroid Prime Remastered, and my goodness, it was one of the most intricately designed and detailed worlds I think I've ever experienced. The interconnectedness, surprises around every other corner, hidden secrets, it was just simply unparalleled. It wasn't all perfect though, as some combat encounters left things to be desired, as it was rather simple, and the lock-on didn't seem to work as intended 100% of the time. Some of the completion requirements seemed excessive too, with some items being hidden in the most unassuming and seemingly pointless areas that never seemed to suggest being of any use. At times it felt like I'd go from a huge room full of puzzles and enemies, and then down a hallway to another huge room full of puzzles and enemies, only to find out that the item I needed was in the hallway, and neither of the huge rooms full of puzzles and enemies. I know some people really like that, but for me, full-on Metroidvanias aren't usually my cup of tea, but I can still appreciate the achievement in world building and design, and I definitely still had a ton of fun. I'm honestly surprised it didn't get a remaster sooner. Sticking with the Switch, I went back to Kirby with Return to Dreamland Deluxe. I got 100% completion in the main mode because I absolutely loved it. With my still growing knowledge of the Kirby franchise, I would simply describe it as Star Allies multiplied by 3. The main story is longer, a ton of extras, and a wide variety of challenge levels, and it all ran perfectly. The only time I ever noticed something was off was during the endgame credits where there was a little bit of pop-in in the background. Otherwise, it was solid gold start to finish. As a fan of the Bayonetta series, I couldn't resist the spin-off, Bayonetta Origins, Cereza and the Lost Demon. It was a slow start with what felt like endless cutscenes and unlimited dialogue, which had me nervous for how the rest of the game was going to be, but at around a quarter of the way through, it picked up fast. From that point on, it was just getting exponentially better every step of the way. The combat mechanics went from feeling like a gimmick retread of Astral Chain to deliberate and very engaging. The exploration went from basic to expansive. The story, unfortunately, kind of stayed the same throughout. It was a bit generic and convoluted with all of the nonsense inherent in multiple timeline stories, but by the end, this prequel of our main protagonist, Bayonetta, as a little girl and her tragic upbringing, ended up being pretty emotional and honestly kind of heartwarming. The performance was perfect and gameplay was crisp. I think my only complaint was not having a dedicated jump button. Jump is shared with whatever other ability you have equipped at the time, which led to some unintended actions and accidental deaths. But thanks to frequent checkpoints and fast respawn times, they usually just got a chuckle out of me instead of actual frustration, but it was an issue either way. Other than that, it was an instant love that I could not recommend enough. Whether a fan of the Bayonetta trilogy or not, it makes for a very good time. Similar to the Stanley Parable, Superliminal is an incredible game that will have you deep in thought pretty much every step of the way. A first-person puzzle adventure that will give you goosebumps with ease. It was exhilarating, thought-provoking, and challenging in the best ways possible. I won't say any more about it because it's another one of those games that you kind of just have to play. I can't really describe it or talk about it in a way to do it any real justice. It's very experiential. One that was not quite as profound for me was Kumaju Remilia Scarlet Symphony. This is a 2D action platformer with some of the smoothest pixel art I've ever seen, gorgeously animated, and some stellar voice acting to complement, with a really strong soundtrack start to finish. Unfortunately, the moment-to-moment gameplay was not one of those positives. For a first playthrough, a lot of enemy attacks are too fast to dodge or reposition for unless you already know what the attack is, and the bosses just multiply this by 10. The game is a spin-off from the bullet hell-focused Touhou franchise, and I think it took too many of those bullet hell elements and applied them too directly, with a lot of gameplay elements feeling out of place in this context. This being a 2D platformer first and foremost, the bullet hell side of things didn't quite translate, making it feel excessive and like enemies are just spamming uncontrollably, while your limited movement makes survival seemingly impossible. There were also a lot of repeated rooms within levels, and each level was very short, making that repetition all the more noticeable. Additionally, Enemy count seemed a little too high, with enemies being placed on almost every other platform, making damage avoidance in general a serious challenge. There are also some limitations with the controls. I played on Switch, so maybe on PC it's easier with custom binds, or an Elite controller with the extra buttons on the back. But with the default controls, there is no dedicated fly button. To fly, you press the jump button twice. So, while intending on jumping, I found myself unintentionally flying pretty often. When flying, your attacks are limited, as your moveset automatically changes, adding to the frustration and difficulty. It had a lot of flaws, but I still found some enjoyment in it. I don't think it's a game I'd play again, but I know a sequel came out in December, which I might try to see if they change the formula at all. If considering, just be absolutely sure you know what the game is beforehand. It had been a while, so I had to dust off the DS to continue with Kirby, this time with Superstar Ultra. I don't have much to say about this one, honestly. It was a solid experience. It definitely has a lot of flavors packed in across the collection of different minigames. Unique, varied, and overall easily enjoyable. It's got a little something for everybody and a sample of other stuff that you can try out if you want. It's an easy recommendation. Being on a bit of a platformer spree, I played Pac-Man World Repack next. It was a decent platformer overall, though it did suffer from quite a few issues. The depth perception, or I guess draw distance, was pretty non-existent, and the camera angles didn't exactly provide any benefits to the player. Hit detection was weird, and by weird I mean inconsistent. I think part of it is because the main attack is a projectile, though goes such a short distance you might as well just have a physical attack, like a punch instead. There was a little bit of backtracking, which felt kind of silly considering the linear level select design, and the final boss was honestly terrible. It had excessively repetitive moves, inconsistent cycles, and some of the hitboxes were very poorly mapped, to the point where I literally phased through the boss to the center of his body while trying to attack, only to then take damage myself and deal none in return. It was challenging for all the wrong reasons. Hopefully all the bugs have been patched since then, but at the time I went through it was pretty rough. I still had some fun with it leading up to the final boss at least, but unfortunately the experience as a whole was just fine. Back to the indie side of things, I tried a game called Diabolic, a very minimalistic action RPG light dungeon crawler kind of thing. The first half was great, but then whoever was in charge of enemy density developed a crippling addiction to the copy and paste function. There are so many enemies it's not even reasonable. Labyrinth is among the worst levels I've ever played in a video game, with the enemy count ramped up so high it was pushing the limits of my comprehension. The collision detection was degrading rapidly, as you'd get stuck on walls just trying to get through the map, and when trying to shoot these massive hordes of enemies swarming towards you, you'd be shooting the wall you're stuck against instead. If leveling any type of naturally, you simply will not be able to make it through this level. There is a significant amount of farming required just to have a chance. There were great concepts, some solid ideas, and I really enjoyed the simple, minimalistic art style, but the gameplay, the mechanics, it was just executed so poorly. Bosses were the standout for me because they played kind of like a bullet hell light, which I actually really enjoyed, but overall, it was just really unfortunate. Then from Diabolic to Diablo 3 Ultimate Evil Edition. I won't say much because it's been out for 12 years at this point, and has plenty of information about it out there, so I'll make it quick. There were amazing environments, really good enemy designs, and a lot of quality of life features, and it was all wrapped around a very enjoyable gameplay loop. You'll rarely feel unfairly underleveled, the grind was never excessive, and even though the stat numbers are inflated beyond reason, I mean going from damage numbers in the hundreds to hundreds of thousands, it all makes for a very satisfying progression. Overall, it was a pretty awesome dungeon crawling grind. I've never been one for fighting games, and by fighting games I mean like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. So naturally I played Red Earth. If you're new to fighting games and thinking about trying one, please do not start with Red Earth. It was unreasonably difficult. It was insanely fast and brutally punishing right from the start. It ran great and looked amazing with some really cool character art, but I was mostly suffering just trying to get through it. In an attempt to feel better about myself, I played Guilty Gear X Advance Edition, or is it 10, for the Game Boy Advance, and it definitely made me feel better. It was a short but good burst of action, it was simple but satisfying, though maybe it's just because of the horrible time I had with Red Earth, as part of me does wish it was a bit more challenging, but then again, it is a simplified version of the Guilty Gear formula, since it's limited to the minimal controls of the Game Boy. I would happily recommend it to someone wanting to try fighting games, but maybe isn't quite confident enough to dive into the bigger mainline entries. Following that fix of fighting games, I tried Little Witch Nobita. Nobita? I don't know how you say it. I'm a big fan of Iron Pineapple's Steam dumpster diving videos, and watching him play the demo and seeing most of the comments say it was really good had me intrigued enough to finally give it a try myself, and I am very glad I did. It was basically a magic-focused, Souls-light shooter. It had really great style and super smooth gameplay for the majority of the runtime, but there was a couple problems. Some of the bosses hit with an excessive knockback to the point where some attacks will literally launch you out of bounds from almost the center of the arena, which makes perfectly timed dodges necessary to avoid an instant ring-out death. Alternatively, the arena could have just been bigger. Either way, there's an issue there. In a couple areas where the level design opens up a bit more and there's a little bit more enemy density, the performance slipped a bit too, with a handful of pretty rough frame drops, but I was playing on the Switch. So let me know in the comments if you had a better performance on other systems. All in all, it was simple but gorgeous, lots of basic enemy designs, but it was never to the point where it grew stale. The bosses were all unique and memorable, and it's a game I can definitely see myself coming back to, especially since they just added a boss rush mode. Once I started, I didn't want to stop. I loved it. And from a high to a low, next I played Remy Lore. I won't say much because there wasn't much to the game. It was excessively repetitive, extremely shallow, had basically no story, and a plethora of repeated assets. It took about 4 hours to beat, but it felt like 10. I'm glad it was so short because I wouldn't be willing to play it any longer. I think the only part I enjoyed was the final boss, and that certainly wasn't enough to make it worth it. After that, I returned to the platformer genre with Klonoa, Door to Phantomile, or Phantomile. I'm not sure. It was simple and straightforward, but all the mechanics were very well implemented. The placement of platforms and enemies made for some pretty interesting encounters and puzzles, but nothing was too confusing or difficult to get hard stuck on. The enemies were simple, but there was still a surprising amount of variety, especially considering the short runtime of about 5 hours. The boss designs were unique and engaging, and the aesthetic of the game as a whole was actually very pleasing, which also made for an interesting juxtaposition with a surprisingly dark story. Next, I went way back, all the way back to the Atari 2600 to play Adventure. It's interesting to see such an early version of a medieval fantasy game. What developers and coders were able to do with such severe limitations is always incredible to me. The simplicity, though of course, not by design but by necessity, is beautiful to me. The creativity to craft something so unique and complete, but also so compact and focused, is inspiring. By standards of today, it may seem comical, but in the context of the original release, it's amazing. Sticking with the medieval theme, but going straight to current day, I played the very long-awaited Diablo 4. I played all the betas and the full game right at release, so I went through all the crashes, glitches, and server issues of release. And that makes it sound bad, but it really wasn't. It was actually an incredibly smooth launch. Those issues were rare, and between them it was nothing but super smooth dungeon crawling goodness. The world is expansive, the builds are satisfying, the options and combinations are seemingly endless, though I know the theory crafters and metagamers say otherwise, but for a casual Diablo player like myself, it was awesome. Visually, the game is stunning. The story was straightforward, but with the main antagonist Lilith, it was all still very captivating. Neyrelle was pretty annoying though, as she was pushed into the spotlight of the story more often than not, even though the majority of the, I'll say, supporting cast was much more interesting. Even with the complaints and performance issues at launch, and after updates and fixes, it was stellar. Though I know the general opinion of the game has kind of soured over time, as a very casual Diablo player, I really enjoyed it. It was a really good time. Coming off that behemoth of a game, I went back to little indie titles for a while, and I started with the puzzle platformer Refunked. It was a great game to relax and space out with. Another one of those games that was kind of meditative, It was super easy to pick up and play and finish in one sitting. I wish I had more to say about it because it was really enjoyable, but it's so straightforward that I'm not sure what else to say. Just give it a try if you have an hour or so and you're not sure what to play, or if you just need to relax after a long day. Naturally, after playing a meditative and relaxing game like that, I had to go to something psychologically disturbing. So I chose Milk Inside a Bag. It was a very short visual novel in which you play the role of the voice inside the head of the main character. However, the main character imagines you, the voice in her head, as a person playing a visual novel about her, typing your responses away. So in a way, you're playing the game as yourself playing the game, which I think was meant to make for an interesting meta perspective, breaking the fourth wall, but it kind of came off as silly. The main character isn't a trustworthy narrator, so you, both as the player and as the voice inside her head, don't really know what's happening, nor do you have a way to confirm or deny what is accurate about the character experience. It just wasn't particularly engaging for me, but just like some other games, I probably missed something along the way. So if you had a better experience, or if you know what the point of the game was, let me know in the comments what I missed and I'll go back and play it again. Maintaining the psychological disturbance, I went on to play No One Lives Under the Lighthouse, which had some really strong moments, great visuals, and a great concept. But even though it's a really short game, only taking around 2 hours to complete, it still felt a little bit too long considering what was provided. Honestly, if it ended before the last third of the game, I think it would have been a much better experience, with a more ominous and ambiguous ending. There is an entire section in which you play as the monster, which has atrocious controls, but of course provides very important narrative elements. Though I would say it provides too much. The story as a whole seems to do that, and that seems to be the main problem. There's not much room for the player to guess or speculate. It would put you in a situation and pose a number of really provoking questions, but then not much later, it would take away all that curiosity and just give you the answers directly. By the end, there was hardly any mystery left. It didn't leave me with much to think about. It looked great and had a really strong atmosphere, but I don't think it was enough in total, and kind of a misstep in terms of storytelling, unfortunately. I thought I was continuing the psychological streak, but I was left disappointed by the time I finished The Test. Another indie interactive story, I think is what I would call it at least. It was literally just a series of questions with a vague scenario and only one nameless character. It honestly kind of felt like bait. It started out feeling like it would lead to some gruesome twist, having a number of outlier questions that really tried to make you uncomfortable. But by the end, the result was very reassuring and positive. The vast majority of comments and user reviews seem to describe positive results too, so I guess it's my fault for not looking at those first. It's nice if you need a little pick-me-up, I guess. Trying to get back to actual horror, I played another low-poly indie game called Eschaton. It was similar to No One Lives Under the Lighthouse in that it had heavy atmosphere, strong tone, and some really powerful imagery, but kind of left it at that. It was very short and very over-the-top, with little in the way of concrete storytelling that came off as a bunch of stuff that just looked and sounded cool. It was like shock value set pieces to walk between. Regardless of the lack of story, the imagery and ambience was enough to entertain through to the end. Wanting some more concrete storytelling after that, I played the point-and-click interactive story If on a Winter's Night for Travelers, and I was not disappointed. There are 3 very unique and very engaging stories with amazing pixel art that led to a very satisfying conclusion. There were a couple parts that felt a bit tedious, with a fair amount of walking back and forth and not being able to tell what I needed to click on. It's a little spooky, a little nasty, and it doesn't take much to get invested. I think it's a great place to start for someone getting into point-and-click games, or games in general if you're alright with the subject matter. Getting back to action, I moved to Crypt of the Serpent King 4K Remastered Edition. What is there to say that hasn't already been said? Look out, From Software, there's a new king. The Serpent King. Don't pay attention to the Game Awards. This is Game of the Year winner for the next 67 years minimum. Seriously though, just read the reviews for this game. They are absolutely hilarious. It's an extremely simple dungeon crawler with hardly any mechanics, lots of old school charm, and I unironically really enjoyed my time with it. Though I couldn't see myself playing more than 2 levels in a sitting, and it only took about an hour and a half to get 100% completion, all achievements. Now it's time for something a little more contentious. Starfield. There is enough to say about Starfield alone to make hours worth of content, so I'm just going to kind of spit out some of my thoughts, so sorry if I'm bouncing around between points. Normally when I pursue a side quest, it's because it piqued my interest enough, on its own, to pull me away from the main story, and this didn't really happen in Starfield for me. I don't know if that's an insult to the side quests, or a compliment to the main story, so take that however you choose, but I personally enjoyed the main story quite a bit. When I first started it, I thought the beginning was kind of terrible, and that you have zero narrative freedom as to the starting point of your character, at least from a role-playing perspective. You are working for a mining company. No way around that. In Oblivion and Skyrim, you can at least make up the reason you've been arrested, being by mistake or for good cause. But in Starfield, there is no wiggle room at all. And that's where the confusion begins. It has RPG elements in that you create your character and select your skills and traits, but then plays very linearly right from the start. I think most people went into it wanting another Fallout or Elder Scrolls, but needless to say, it is neither of those. So I, not too long after the intro, realized I shouldn't play it wishing it was Fallout or Elder Scrolls. So I played it based off what the game showed me, and that alone, without making any comparisons. Starfield didn't feel like an open-world RPG, and looking at the path it pushed me toward, it felt like the intended experience was purely linear. For example, in Fallout and Elder Scrolls, you will often have the opportunity to walk between objectives, giving you ample time to stumble upon side quests with more than enough distractions and set pieces to put you on a new path until you decide to return to the main questline. But in Starfield, it's all fast traveling right from the start, with no alternative, with the map functioning more like a level select menu. So I played it that way. There wasn't really any incentive to deviate from the main quest or to explore random planets. The main quest just always seemed to be what I should be doing and like the most interesting option at pretty much any given time. Some levels or areas went on too long or had gimmicks that overstayed their welcome. And if you've played, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But overall, the main story was solid. It was still over the top and silly at times, but it just came off as sort of campy to me. All that said, there were some setbacks from playing it so linearly. I didn't engage with basically any of the additional mechanics. I never upgraded or modified any weapons, I never built a base of any kind, and I only modified my ship once to get more grav drive power, and the main quest never gave me a reason to do any of those other things. It ran surprisingly well on Series X, the performance was consistently strong. I think I only had a couple visual glitches and maybe a handful of weird moments with AI. It's a game I can see myself coming back to, so I can do all that extra stuff in side quests, which maybe by the end of that will sour my opinion. But having played the way I did, I really enjoyed it. It was a good time, and like I said before, Starfield can easily be discussed for hours. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in a more objective deep dive for a future video. I can only play AAA games for so long before I feel the need to get back to indie though. So I picked up Lunistis, which is basically Tori 3D, but bigger and better in just about every way. There's more gameplay variety, more settings, combat, traversal options, much larger and more dynamic maps. It also had a stellar soundtrack, an actual story, and similarly smooth gameplay. But, just like in Tori 3D, it also had some collision issues with platforms, and some odd camera behavior in a few levels. Even with those quirks, it was great start to finish and makes for a great couple hours of platforming fun. I still had that indie platforming itch though, so I went straight into Super Kiwi 64, another plain and simple retro-inspired indie gem. I got 100% completion, it was another straightforward little platforming collectathon, that you could easily beat in just a couple hours, and if you got a couple hours, I recommend it. I couldn't enjoy too many games in a row though, so I had to be thoroughly disappointed by Modern Warfare 3. It is, without a doubt, the worst of the Modern Warfare reboots, the worst of modern Call of Duty, and the more I think about it, the more inclined I am to say the worst Call of Duty campaign we have ever had. The story, if you could even call it that, had basically nothing of value. It bounced around from a bad mission to an excuse for a mission, and by that I mean the open combat levels, to literal wastes of time, and all of it was littered with terrible performance, pop-in, missing textures, visual and audio glitches galore, with the most performance-focused settings possible. I took a lot more notes, but honestly, I disliked it so much, I don't even want to give it any more time here. It was just terrible. If you want me to talk about the plethora of flaws in actual detail, let me know in the comments and I'll sacrifice part of my sanity, meaning play the game more, to do so for you. But as far as this video goes, that's all I got. Needing to recover from that horrible disappointment, I turned back to indie with Momotype, another short visual novel that stylistically reminded me of Milk Inside a Bag, but was much more psychedelic, subtle, focused, and had actual options and twists. When I finished, I immediately wanted to play through it again to make different decisions and see the alternate outcomes. It had me pondering for a good while as opposed to just saying exactly how things were and what they meant, like some other games did. It was genuinely intriguing and gets an easy recommendation from me. Also, it's free and takes less than an hour to finish, so you really have no excuse. But to further ensure my recovery from the tragedy of Modern Warfare 3, I played a guaranteed winner, Super Mario Wonder. Another game that has had its praises sung more than enough, so I won't say much here other than it was playful, whimsical, and yes, wonderful. It's packed full of surprises and spectacle to keep you engaged through every second, with a great soundtrack, perfect performance, vibrant visuals, and more than enough creativity to blow your mind over and over. And that's coming from someone who didn't really think they were a fan of Mario games at the start of the year. Now this is going to sound bad, but I don't remember why I decided to get Lords of the Fallen. All the promotional material looked amazing, but just about everything I heard about it was terrible. And when I got it, I was in the middle of another Elden Ring playthrough, so I wasn't exactly eager to get to another massive and punishing Souls-like. But praise Aureus, I am so glad I got it. As a side note, I didn't get it at release, so I'm sure all those initial negative review videos and criticisms were true and genuine, but within only a month or so after launch, when I got it, they seemed to have remedied almost all of the major complaints. In general, I absolutely loved it. There were some slips, some performance hiccups, and multiplayer stability still isn't really there at all, but in general, and specifically as a single-player experience, it is fantastic. I don't want to say much more here because I'm planning to do a dedicated video on it, so I'll just end by saying it was easily, without a single doubt, my personal game of the year. And if you played it at launch and hated it, please give it another chance. And if you haven't played it, but have been thinking about trying it, well, just get to it. At the time of writing this script, I'm still playing it, planning to get all the different endings. I'm just hooked. It was the last game I beat in 2023, and it was an incredible way to finish the year. And I'm definitely looking forward to playing more of it, and who knows how many other games in 2024. I certainly didn't finish my backlog, so I've got plenty to look forward to, and I hope to see you along the way. Let me know in the comments what you played in 2023, and what some of your favorites were, and give me some recommendations too. What would a backlog be if you didn't keep adding to it? Anyways, and as always, stay happy, stay healthy, and I hope to see you next time.